Alrighty. We'll probably give it a few minutes and then get going.
Sounds
I will also, if you don't mind, record it in case anyone wants to watch it after the fact for posterity.
super.
Um, yeah.
It's safe to say it's been a hard year. I can't believe she kept me here. I'd write it out, talk about it. You took me in, your arms inside. No, it's not easy to see. There's always closer. You only say.
Alrighty. I feel like we might as well get started, and then as people trickle in, they can join us, and we can have it recorded after the fact anyway. Hello, everyone. My name is Johnny. I work at Lost City Books. For those of you who may not know, we are a new, used, and rare bookstore located in Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C. We have a great time bringing a variety of speakers and activists, and most importantly, authors to do events with us here at the store and virtually. Some general notes about how this is going to go is that there will be a brief reading from Evan Kennedy, who's going to be reading from his poetry book, Metamorphoses, and then we'll have a brief conversation between him and I, and then there might be a Q&A portion at the end for people who are watching. It means a lot that you would tune in at all, virtually or from wherever you are in this little world. We couldn't do what we do as a bookstore and all of our ventures without people like you showing up, coming to our events, buying books, browsing, etc. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Evan Kennedy, who is here to read, as I mentioned, his poetry collection, Metamorphoses. Metamorphosis springs from Ovid's epic poem to explore the slipperiness of identity. In poems that shift registers from travelogue to elegy, from nature documentary to a simple record of the realities of daily life, Kennedy focuses on transformation, personal and collective, in an empire in decline, in a world transfigured by ecological upheaval. Evan Kennedy is a poet and a bicyclist. He's the author of I Am I? To trust the joy, that joy is no more or less there now than before. Jerusalem Notebook, The Sissies, Terra Firmament, Shoe-ins to Ruin, and Us Them Poems. He runs the occasional press, Dirty Swan Projects, and was born in Beacon, New York in 1983. And he currently lives in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming, though I suppose it's virtual. I'm so used to saying that. Evan Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Johnny. It's nice to join you from San Francisco to bring the two coasts together. It's a pleasure to read from Metamorphoses, a book about animals and empire. So I'll just dig right in. To Ovid. I tracked you in Rome this September, where statues, your contemporaries, lack arms, noses, cocks, casualties of time's war on us or changes in taste. We share atoms with countless living and dead, missing marble limbs, but I pursue unclaimed meat, stray unincorporated matter, moving through plumbing, open forms, atmospheres, malls, your anonymous grave. Excluded, indifferent to the constant world, you made epic the body split from within. Faces erupting from different species features, new life forms emerging in your darling bucolic anatomical theater, perverse as free verse. I am as foreign to you as articulation in the entropy I inhabit, a barbaric language I cannot understand because I am made of it, in elegy. I'm not pursuing you exactly, but resemblance through subjectless tissue and muscle, expanding grim tradition to keep leopards happy, lounging in mossy temples long after belief. And this is an old story, maybe 1,500 years old, 1,800 years old, that I read in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, misremembered and refigured. This is called The Seven Sleepers. I'm done for, I'm ruined, I'm toast. I misremembered the story of the seven sleepers. At tonight's recitation, I said they were pagans who went hunting, fell into a cave, and woke centuries later. Exhilarated to be alive, they danced hooting and hollering back to their hometown. Their gratitude transformed the dreary suburb into paradise. If their filthy, outdated clothes didn't bewilder the locals, what the sleepers said did. They said, "We're your ancestors." The locals replied, "What? How? You're younger than us." But the resemblance was undeniable. Each of the seven sleepers had a counterpart in town, same birthmark or lisp or nervous demeanor, characteristics that almost make us unique. You know, in another time, I too must have a counterpart. He is in Rome, feeling handsome and spectral, and with no place for shade, he speeds through his itinerary and arrives at flattened sunlit ruins like a dazzling stranger. At any rate, tonight, before 80,000 in the Colosseum, I recited terribly inaccurately that despite the tense mood, the seven sleepers told their descendants it's a good idea to give thanks. They had gathered Narcissus and Chrysanthemum to wrap around a young bull's budding horns. They had laid traps for birds to sacrifice. Too far into my narrative to be corrected, I said the sleeper with a nervous look saw that the temple's reliefs of Apollo and Diana had been mutilated. Niches he'd venerated centuries earlier were emptied of their robust marble deities. I described how the seven sleepers lowered their eyes before they could spot on top of the temples the imposing, almost immaterial crosses that triumphed over them. Several hours into my recitation, I was dragged off stage. Instead of the kisses of adulation a recitation artist should expect, I got slapped across my mouth. It turns out the seven sleepers were Christians. When they had returned to their village, they learned their descendants had kept that faith and eliminated all dissenters. Officials in the know said, You know, you have passed off a perverse variation of the perfected artificial myth whose syllables have been preserved here for centuries. It's not the seven sleepers who are ruined. I am. It's the end for me. The story, a lesson, had been entrusted to me. Our society survives on poetry alone. I've been celebrated nationwide for my flawless recitations, and now you rivals will sniff around this evening's transcription for my fatal flaw. It's an error I must have intended. You're welcome. Tonight, I was given the burden of a solitary dreamer, a twin I'm becoming, a new start hand in hand with memory and imagination. Since I'm beginning to like them, my sleepers, like I'm becoming the eighth, I wonder where we'll escape under cover of the night. This book also has several poems to deities that are no longer addressed very much. This is to Apollo, and it has an epigraph from Jennifer Moxley. I dream of the death of the sun. Apollo is in certain incarnations affiliated with the sun. And this poem is for Brett Price. When I say your name, Apollo, I lend you living breath. You possess me, my body unsuited for a deity, but full of desire and contempt. That's life enough. I prolong your existence. I lay devotions at your feet for your work as the sun, creator of life, peeler of sunburns. I drove to Nevada City here in California after evacuation orders lifted. Fire destroyed almost 40 homes. It's 80% contained, they say, though as your haphazard devotee, I know nothing contains you. Maybe one cell of mine, if anything does. Light must be intuited within us, carried like endorphins or vitamins. I keep naming you to sustain me and keep death away. You know, I think of death only as a romantic, like you fucked me in my bed, a burning fissure or volcano. Some friends speak of ecological collapse, the warming that follows our thinning defenses, but I just think they're afraid of their death. All that talk is a stand-in. They turned their back to Apollo, spurned you as you hurry your approach to us. Their world went dark. It's something I won't let myself do, not yet. I accept the sunburns and fires and conjugate from my weakness an active assertion that you, Apollo, exist, and we because of you. I fear loneliness, being misunderstood, especially in poems, venereal disease, the collapse of the empire where I was born. Planetary collapse is something I hope my death will precede, perhaps at dawn, like Lou Reed staying up all night, awed by beauty as his body finished rejecting his new liver. Long Island beauty. Being up all night terrifies me. Anticipating dawn's arrival, I hurry to bed. If I try sleeping with you nearby, it's too late to make anything of the day you give. I want to be given many more, but seeing you rise, seeing dawn, no way, absolutely not. I've been animals. I've slept under the eyes of mountain ranges and ocean depths. I've been complimented on my school, brood, cauldron, and pounce. I have caught mice that keep Kafka awake. I've suckled twins who establish an empire. I've destroyed the robot imposter that enters my territory. I've begged tourists for snacks and friendly scratches behind my antlers. I've stormed the Prado and flown endlessly before the Goyas. I've preened myself until the sky goes gray and I turn to glass. I've glided low and parallel to rivers. I've been defended by my gaggle, pod, pack, gang, murder, clutter, caravan, pod, conspiracy, quiver, zeal, herd, cackle, shadow, and pride. I've even had other species answer when calling for a mate. I failed to recognize Dionysus, so he turned me into a dolphin. I've regurgitated mango to resuscitate a wasp. I've drunk from the corner of a human eye. I've lifted my snout above the pit. I've eaten fetuses that napped in dead leaves. I've hopped the magic mountains, bright vermilion boulders. I've rubbed noses in cul-de-sacs off tight, damp tunnels. I've been rejected from my herd in blazing salt flats. I've felt the shape of my bones under my scales, plumes pelt. I've been out in front of a dozen dead oceans. I've greeted humankind as its distant predecessors, savage and exiled. I've dropped from my claws a stupid meteorite you worship. I've been metamorphosed and hunted by the dogs I trained. I've landed on the face of your Messiah in anguish. I have been lassoed and bound when elsewhere I'm so revered no driver dares honk at me. I've stared down Thoreau, who likens my head to a mix of squirrel and bear. I've dragged a slice of pizza into a Second Avenue F-train tunnel. I've hijacked my host from its inside and led it wherever I want. I've been flipped around and sheared by that hick more than I would like to admit. I have played dead and admired the living. I've tasted an apple unfinished by Hervé Guibert dying of AIDS. I've nested in streets of radioactive waste, branches, vines. I've sung at your ear's upper limit. I've grunted and squealed over Shelley's recitation. I've led processions wearing the mask of my ancestor, Anubis. I've sung to be heard by exiled Ovid. He stopped writing. I've not yet won you, so what is this worth? I was revisiting the canon for some of these poems, and this is a collection of all the instances in Walter Jackson Bates' biography of John Keats, where Keats imitates an animal. He seemed to entertain his friends by doing this. I guess he had less resources than Shelley. Keats' routines. The Cockney poet hoisted himself dominant like the sea-shouldering whale, gaping for sustenance with capacious mouth like newborn birds, dabbling his forepaws hither and thither like a baited bear, spinning from his mind a spider's airy citadel of verse. Then he took part in the life of a sparrow, pecking at his window as he convalesced. Why the oracle disappeared is unclear. His metered speech loosened. His imagery, once perfect interplay of instruction and symbol, soon became so obscure that we lost interest in studying his imprecise pronouncements, which, approaching the oracle's 1000th year in our village, deteriorated into a murmur of homonyms, split infinitives, and cliché, a near wordless exhalation. Was that pen as in enclose or as in write? Wound as in injure or wound, as in wrapped around the Virgin standing indignantly before that vaporous tripod, incense, sacrifice? Perhaps people cannot tremble through an entire millennium. For delivery boys, art handlers, immigrants, physicists, postcard vendors like me, it's difficult to tell. Our uncertainty indicates the oracle failed. At the very least, there's a crisis, leading our oracle to disappear or speak on diminished authority. Evidence supports both theories. Leaving the oracle, visitors report a mishmash of gestures, riddles, etymologies, events, negations. My ear stays tuned to the Warriors game on the radio. No matter my spotless conduct, I cannot ask the oracle to reflect on himself. Doing so might cause our homes or our culture, which unites our community and dialect, to explode. It's all plausible in the so-called navel of the world. Phaethon and the constellations. I don't know what neurons begin firing when I try to talk like the galaxy I occupy. I say this kid loses control of sun's chariot. Flames sweep through space. orbits unfetter. We fall into each other, each star unfixing, every claw, belt, fin, horn, mane, hoof of ours disbanding. I am drifting, spinning, burning, swinging around alien axes as what was my horn gores you before you change shape. Globular clusters crowning a fish's head, winging other illogical pairings, until the correspondences between shape and symbol, our only language, fail. We forget our names, racing through and extending equinoxes, seasons, a contraction or spasm through burgeoning decimation, a blossom eliminating equators, a tear distended over boiling seas. Time is inoperative in torn orbit, meteorologists' disbelief. Bucolic. I chased her into treehood. Only my devotion is unchanged. My navel hair picked of lice, while from her it's caterpillar, gypsy moth. Blood filtering, sap sucking, saliva splashing. My eye is not subject, but station for experience, desire. Bedroom doors, aerial roots. Our transformations are accurate unto themselves. A sense of Orpheus. I cling to my wife's coffin as it speeds to Earth's center, my head bumping 300 BPM through geologic eras, an alphabet scratched onto me, Gutenberg discontinuity. In hell, I sing, if my music is perverted through transcription, I'll simply lose it. No one wants to reverse your system more than I. Back on earth, boys' groins resemble my lyre. With so many eyes on me, I have to put mine somewhere, a shallow furrow I might not return from. I am awake when a snake swallows my spine. Fragmented, I keep creeping. I am nameless when Wolfgang Amadeus or Tori Amos lifts notes from my tongue. Dismembered, I keep speaking. I learned to play by imitating nature. I strummed and trilled to animals and elements composing me. Wildlife didn't resemble me. My behavior was theirs originally. I was only a stag-headed hunter, a dolphin-tailed swimmer, a lizard-tongued exterminator, a horse-eyed rider. My left eye is clenched in the beak of a migrating ibis, the sun illuminating the underside of its wing. My vision overrun by joyous ants and maggots. Wildlife running back from extinction would burn the calluses off my fingers. My right hand, severed at the wrist, is nesting 4 speckled eggs in a pine. Looking back at my wife was an admission that I doubt my discipline. Interrogating that doubt is the job of these animals. Tree of life. In the tree of life, I lose my way. Upper branches, tangled vines, self-reflected creation. It's not my decision to forget my origin. A sunbeam illumines me, my descendants, inferiors, and branches below, my own face blooming, smiling, cawing. I was birthed, raised from below, lifted onto a branch, then I fell into gravity's biomass. The tree of life calls to me, inscribes my lineage. Ears enclose a sonic globe. Beside me, my contemporaries, close relations within touch. While I jump, swing, fly to others farther away, I resemble less. Hold on to that image, recite it. I wait for these branches to be canceled. Entire history is existent within me. My identity comprises life, nothing more. My appearance is its alteration. This poem is also titled Tree of Life. In the tree of life, I adorn each branch with speech and action. When unaccompanied, I can't even adorn the gate of the tree's enclosure, that boundary of corpses and debris. When outside of life, my adorning is transitory, whisked away, trampled and bled. I lift an ear or whatever is receptive. A cry is transcribed in my adorning, or a fire or flood, visible through branches, plumage, foliage. Serve life, I intoned. I'm encouraged through speech, gestures, grunts, looks. What reason for you? Why do you look? Voice reveals anatomy, a form circulated by speech. I observe, I experience, but not at the same time. Purification, exhaustion, rest, apprehension, defilement, anxiety, concentration, forgery, doubt, excitement, union. I am a small gray fox carrying an infinitesimally small artifact from the body of Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is also titled Tree of Life. In the Tree of Life, I revise my animal body. I edit my poem. By unremarked changes, creation moves around and within me. Orbits animate nature. Nature disbands, retreats, implodes, so that I name them when I make my first sound. In the Tree of Life, my vantage will change by what species I speak as. My speech not existing for itself, but as a branch toward being, a branch one keeps following until another is met or it breaks, dropping me extinct. These roots, the inverse image of our branches. When will these distinctions be unneeded? I ask because I doubt I can specify I any longer. Regardless, when I ask my question, it will be with the same elocution, charm, desire. And I'll close with a San Francisco poem. San Francisco chase scene. Help. I'm being chased through this infinite city, this dubious utopia. Pedaling my bike full speed past startup hells, I cough and gasp, my seducer just behind me. If you ever need to escape, you don't dare look back or even blink. My thighs burn and cramp, my heart almost bursting when I swallow bugs splattered through my eyes. Sure, I bike fast, but this creep is my equal and headbutts my back wheel. I steady myself, then turn sharp on Dubose Ave against the wind. Onlookers panicked. Idiot, look out. Hey, that's a stop sign. My near collisions include a pricey stroller with overgrown toddler on iPad, a dog more expensive than my rent, a pissed off driver wearing an always tasteless LA Dodgers cap. Weaving between cars, honking for my death, I yell help. Teeth tear my ankles and calves, blood and spit flying. Then an ecstatic blast splits this terrible scene. One of my household gods hears me. Is it Bob Dylan in Malibu, plagiarizing Juvenile? Shiva in Omkareshwar, admiring the marigolds I offered? Exiled Ovid, trimming his laurel crown? Or is it Franz Kafka, watching traffic through the eyes of a stray dog? Whoever it is drops everything, and with my face in mind, they ask where, when, how. They know my name and devotion. I slip from the pedals, a tearing sound. My black Converse rip open from toenails made into talons. Wings burst from my shoulders, ruin my black jacket, spread and thrash the air so that a leap from my pedals lifts me off my bicycle. In winged society, I peek through Victorian windows, these awful condos of steel and glass, transformations of the city I love. I want to give thanks, but I've lost my elocution. Tail feathers thrash in my pants, black denim slipping off my legs in tatters. Teeth lengthen, fuse, and sharpen. It's a slender beak for my new hunger. Maybe it's fine. Maybe I've outlived my life and its obsessions. Unacquainted with my new species, I take to the sky unthinkingly from Elgin Park. This is the block where one of my favorite poets, Ronald Johnson, lived. My failed assailant is raging below me, kicking my bicycle. To me, it's useless. I won't recognize it tomorrow. All right, Johnny, back to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Evan. I am very quickly going to turn on the light because it got dark in my room. But oop, thank you so much for reading. It was wonderful to listen to. My first question, I suppose, a good place to start is, so much of this book derives from Ovid and, Metamorphoses, but also a number of other mythical pantheons, whether it's Shiva or Anubis and that kind of thing. The first question is relatively general, and it's just where did sort of did you love? Where's the origin of the love of myth or that kind of thing? Does it come from childhood? For me, it's a place of childhood, but is it something that you investigated solely for the project, or?
Well, I encountered Ovid's Metamorphoses 20 years ago. Yeah, I read it for the first time then. And of course, we were pretty familiar with so many of these stories like Narcissus and like Phaethon being and Icarus. So there's this familiarity that was instant to me when I was 20 reading it. And I grew up in Texas. So it is very bizarre that Ovid's retelling of these stories would reach me, and even the cowboys I was going to school with at the time. So I suppose there's something really special about encountering work, whether it's books or music, in one's adolescence. I guess one's brain is still developing, and one is super impressionable.
Yeah, it gets enshrined in a way.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Um, but yeah, I kind of forgot Ovid for quite a while. But during the pandemic, thanks in part to my friendship with Bruce Boone, who's independent scholar of ancient Rome, I returned to it, and I did need a big lofty subject to spend quarantine looking into. So ancient Rome was one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these stories started to grab me. So in a way, I was kind of uniting issues of empire with ancient Rome,
Mhm.
and what the country we currently live in, and also just digging back into these stories that left such a deep impression on me.
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite myth or story?
I suppose yeah, it's a really good question.
It's broad. It's a very broad question, but
Yeah.
you get to answer in that way. But
I suppose one motif that continually recurs in Ovid is the chase. So I wouldn't say this is a favorite because it is
sure.
about sexual consent violations and even just like outright rape, which one recent translator highlighted very well. But that is something, the idea of a chase. So Apollo and Daphne, Apollo the god chasing
Yeah.
Daphne, who begs to be delivered from this attempted rape, and who turns into a laurel tree, which figures quite a bit in Apollo's story afterward. Um, there's something about the chase and the idea of a pursuit that seems to be archetypal and seems to recur in my work. That last poem I read, which is almost first in the book, is
Mhm.
titled San Francisco Chase Scene, and it stems from an essay by Dodie Bellamy, who's a wonderful writer here in the Bay Area. She's part of a group called New Narrative, and her essay is about her husband, Kevin Killian, who's a fantastic poet and writer who passed away a few years ago, his interest in chase scenes in movies. And so I wanted to pull together so many different images of the chase. For example, the movie Bullet that takes place here in San Francisco, and San Francisco is well known for its hills, which don't necessarily lend themselves to a chase. But I suppose that would be one
Yeah,
aspect of myth that keeps
certainly.
coming up.
Certainly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I also, I mean, I suppose not a great deal of myth, and particularly happily, but I do love, or am transfixed by, the story of Narcissus and the story of Orpheus. It is fascinating to think about how the story of Orpheus kind of appears in variations across cultures and that kind of thing. Sir Orfeo, in terms of like old, like English myth, what then becomes, the same persons that are thinking about.
Yeah, and the Monteverdi opera.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating, but
well, yeah, I mean, it's such a rich story. And a friend of mine, I guess around 20 years ago, when I was first reading Ovid, was talking about Orpheus is turning back as an indication of that he doubts his craft. So he's talented enough to make trees move and to persuade the dead and all of that, but there's something about doubt that's might be lingering. It may not just be excitement for him to see Eurydice once again. And I think that's kind of like it's a cautionary tale of sorts.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating too, because I think the fear with any mythical retelling or any poetry about myth I've written, a small handful, is you're writing something that literally has been written about innumerably throughout history, and which is not to say that you have to say something new, because saying something new is not necessarily the point of writing a good poem. But I've been fascinated in all of the various ways and places that the Orpheus myth has come up, whether it's through regular old myth retellings, whether it's through Broadway shows like Hadestown, or it's a motif in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, the 2019 French film. I think it's interesting. Yeah. And so I just wanted to, I guess it's a good lead into the next question, which merges what you briefly touched on about San Francisco and the themes of that. And that, what's it like? Like, can you talk a bit about the process of repurposing or like contemporizing? Not sure if that's a word, but like modernizing and adapting for the kind of project that you have in this book, which is simultaneously myth and also San Francisco, and also like what is that like? Did it feel easy? Were there challenges? Were some myths more transposable than others, etc.?
I suppose I just wanted to make a superimposition. So I wrote a book about San Francisco and St. Francis of Assisi, the namesake of the city. And I drew parallels between St. Francis's love of ecology, of animals, and fraternity, and that sort of thing. So I suppose I was always looking for correspondences. And yeah, to go back to the chase scene, I have been chased through the streets by drivers while on my bicycle. So that's going to happen wherever. And then there are ecological concerns also in the book. So this idea of Phaethon losing control of the chariot that pulls the sun, and burning the earth and burning the galaxies and the constellations of the world, just of the universe disbanding. That almost seemed like an early depiction of global warming. So I suppose, I'm trying to make these stories new and treat them with enough reverence, but also allow some sort of flexibility to keep them vibrant and not be too reverent. What's interesting is Ovid, he's kind of urbane and snooty. So when he's telling some of these stories, like the death of Orpheus, where he's dismembered, it reads like a slasher, like the script of a slasher movie. It's just so over the top and gory and ridiculous. It's almost campy. So it's kind of fascinating how he just can't resist kind of turning up his nose at these sorts of things. So, I think Ovid was also making fun of them, or while making them new and giving them due reverence. And I also think that there wasn't a great opportunity to rework these stories, because among the poets in the Bay Area, I just hadn't heard Ovid talked about, or these stories. So we're just a little too concerned with something else, I guess, than the classics, which is perfectly fine. There are like numerous issues to grab one's attention.
Sure. Have you always been? Are you someone who enjoys the classics or things of that sort, or is, like, I know you mentioned St. Francis of Assisi, like, are you sort of drawn to a sort of more, I don't know, like classical literature or like historical literature and things of that sort?
Well, I'm monolingual and I have no discipline to learn languages, so I have to rely on translations. But I would say I'm more of like an armchair theologian. So I was very interested. I think there's been a Christian inflection, maybe a queer Christian inflection on a lot of my books. And I set out to make this kind of my pagan book. So I became very interested in the cult of Magna Mater, also known as Cybele, which came from the East and during the time of ancient Rome. And yeah, I mean, also Apollo, Dionysus, and other figures like that, these ideas of sort of household gods, and that there were just so many, and they were crowding the area and crowding people's homes and all personal altars. So I think there's more of a theological interest or obsession than the classics. And I do wish I had the discipline to learn Latin, but it was never in the cards.
Certainly. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to blame you for not learning Latin.
I know, it's so
yeah, I think that's fascinating. It's interesting to me about how I have never read, besides a small handful of excerpts or selections, I've never read Ovid or the Metamorphoses, and yet so much of my knowledge of myth, if I were to like trace it back, even if it is, as a kid I grew up reading Percy Jackson and that kind of thing, even if those are my entry points, a lot of the stories that I know, as I understand them, come from Ovid's telling of them, and how they've kind of become like his work is kind of what put it on the map in a way, for me at least.
Yeah, I don't know to what degree it seemed like he has created the definitive version. So I do kind of wonder to what degree he added to what was around, and to what degree his additions sort of clung on. So,
and it's also, obviously incredibly difficult to find anything, earlier. You're not going to find like actually this is a disputing text or something.
Yeah. May I ask what your interest is in Narcissus? Because that's really interesting.
I
couldn't approach Narcissus.
So something I did when I was working on my undergraduate thesis was, my thesis basically was twofold. It was like a two-pronged question. One was, what would it look like / how would the myths that we understand and know, Icarus, Medusa, Narcissus, right? How would those myths change if all of the heroes therein were Black, right? Like, what is the story, just by that single change, does the story mean something else or leave a different taste in the mouth? And then simultaneously, the other half of the thesis was about mythologizing like contemporary Black folks and stories and that kind of thing. What would it be like to turn a modern day story, a story from 2015 or someone from the 90s or early 2000s, into some sort of mythical figure? And I became, driven on this project of, okay, I'm going to take a handful of, Greek and Roman heroes and tragic figures throughout mythology, and I'm just going to see what it would be like. And I made this like long sonnet crown and that kind of thing, and it was very fun and like challenging in a myriad of ways. But the very first one I wrote before it was a crown, before it was anything, was actually the narcissist one, about essentially uh, a like a Black young man falling in love with essentially himself, and the seeing something so beautiful out in the world that looks like him, and how, then when he is killed or cursed and that kind of thing, it feels crueler than it does when it's just narcissism. You know what I mean? When it's like, oh, I haven't seen Black beauty in the world, now here it is, I can't, how could I possibly look away, and that kind of thing. That was something that I found particularly, I don't know, that was something that like stuck with me, because by any other imagination of the story, narcissists just can't get enough of himself. But I found myself really, I guess, captivated, to put a little, I guess, be a little punny about it, but captivated by how just the desire to like want to see like Black beauty that is like beyond marring or beyond any sort of like disfigurement or something, like something that is impossible to look away from, etc., etc.
Well, the Minotaur is a fascinating companion of sorts to Narcissus. So Narcissus, alone, beautiful, falls in love with himself. The Minotaur, a monster, the first of its kind, locked into a labyrinth. So I did write that piece in Metamorphoses as a monologue in the voice of a Minotaur. And I view him kind of as like a queer figure of sorts. So something about like gay isolation and kind of maybe feeling a little monstrous and being feeling the first of a species.
Totally. Or this, the idea of like monster theory or like othering what you don't understand. When I took a contemporary horror class in college, one of the things we talked about is that often horror, like old horror, is just, you could boil it down to like, even like Dracula, it's a great story, but also it's like fear of the foreigner, right? This person is coming from another country and is like stealing our women and is like elusive and that kind of thing. And you can apply that kind of like monster theory to so many marginalized and like othered communities. Whether
go on.
Sorry. I was going to say, whether it's Black folks or queer folks or any numerous variations, disabled folks, etc. How many times are disabled people like the monsters for simple disabilities, that kind of thing?
Yeah. You see Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast as sort of a queer allegory. So it makes sense.
Yeah. And so, but I had a lot of fun with that project. Some of them were easier to transpose than others. It became a thing of like, sometimes, the myth I really like, I like can't really use because like I don't really have an angle of talking about it, but helps that there are so many, so you can really kind of pick.
Among your poet friends, is Ovid or are these myths discussed much? What's your take on that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if Ovid is discussed all that much. I think myth generally is popular, and there's a kind of, at least to me, a desire to write about it because you can write about something, you can use figurative language, but also you have this basis of a story that most people are aware of and most people know. The poem I wrote about Icarus that I used for the project is essentially, it reimagines in a way Icarus as like a runaway slave escaping to like the north, someplace like further north than he has ever been, and before he arrives, struck down, sent to an unfamiliar south, underworld, etc., etc. But and I think then that's where being, at least for me, wanting to be like really precise and really clear about what the goal was, and it wasn't just, I'm writing an Icarus poem. because there are so many, which I don't want to use that as deterrent, because I don't think the existence of something means that it shouldn't be done as well. But I guess that does kind of segue into the next question slash idea that I have. But besides Ovid and some writers and thinkers that you've already just mentioned, are there any other poets or writers or people working today, whether translators or authors, etc., that you feel like your work is in conversation with, or that you feel like you really draw from for your own work, etc.?
Well, there's a very great community here, and that's one reason why I moved here. It's just and by community, I mean a community of poets. So I moved here in the Bay Area in 2009, and we were all finding our way at that point. We were mostly late 20s, early 30s, though there were a fair amount of elders. But I would go to readings, usually at houses, so which would turn into parties and that sort of thing. But people would have the notebooks open and just be taking notes. So it was this kind of collective forging of our style. And, I'll only speak for myself. I was pretty ignorant. I didn't know much. So that was kind of a resource to experiment a fair amount. So I could name them. My friend Brandon Brown, a fantastic writer and translator, and really bending the ideas of translation. Jacqueline Frost was kind of my sister in spiritual delinquency. So she and I delved deeper and maybe radicalized our approach to Christianity. And that was a really important friendship to have. She's in Paris now, unfortunately, so I do not bump into her as much as I need to. But it would be funny because we really wrote our first books in parallel and maybe with our minds melded. So I would hear her read a line and I would just be kind of shocked that she took it from one of my poems. And I realized that I actually took it from hers. So there's a really great exchange going on. And I can go on and on. There have been younger poets like Noah Ross, who's wrote about gay issues. His most recent book, Active Reception, was put out by Nightboat. And there's also been some very great local presses here. Krupskaya, small press that published me, that Brandon currently works at. Jocelyn Seidenberg, a fantastic poet, has been running that press. And in terms of like elders, gay poet Aaron Shurin has been really, really important. He has a few books out on City Lights. This group, New Narrative, that I mentioned, that was sort of collapsing high and low culture, bringing sort of literary theory and cultural issues into the same text. So, and talking about their gay lives, their sex lives and gossip at a time in the late 70s and 80s. That just wasn't quite spoken about so overtly. So Bruce Boone has become an elder. He's part of that generation. Bob Gluck, whose book Marjorie Kemp was recently reissued by New York Review of Books. Dodie Bellamy, as I mentioned, and Kevin Killian. My friend Jason Morris, another fantastic poet, and I are editing a collection of Kevin's collected poems that'll be put up by Nightboat in a year or so. So it's been fantastically generative, and it is one of the main reasons why I stay here. But of course, this was a book written during the pandemic, so I did not have as many opportunities to test work in front of people. So some of my most important readings have been these house readings in front of 15, 20 of my friends, where I have something new that nobody's seen, that I'm nervous about, that I have a lot at stake on, a lot invested in. And it's just a fantastic group to run things by. I could just go on and on. Jacob Kahn is a writer who wrote a book in response to Virgil's eclogues, so a contemporary almost of Ovid. So he and I are just kind of partners in antiquity and that sort of thing. So it's just, the best way to get ideas is just through your friends.
Yeah, certainly. I agree with that a lot. I remember in one of our final writing classes in undergrad, our professor emphasized the fact that, like, you know, when you think about writing communities or networking or things like that, like the peers who will support you or whatever are the ones like in this room. Like it was a conversation about like networking is the wrong word, but I use it in this case, like
Oh,
networking laterally instead of up and down, which I think is really refreshing because of how it kind of is the antithesis to networking in most other models of business, where you want to sort of reach up and have someone like pull you up or like deem your work or your ethic or something like worthy of some sort of next rung in the ladder, when often so much of the work that I enjoy, that I'm invested in, whether it's poetry or other things or other sort of creative endeavors, I think most creative endeavors work really well when your network and peers are the people that are like on the same level, interested in similar things, and you all sort of like buoy yourselves up together.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of scene has negative connotations, but it's really the flip side to community.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, in on the West Coast, we're a bit more laid back. We're too laid back, and we have sort of a regional allegiance to each other. There's not so much the careerism out east, but I mean, they are very, very similar. And I don't think I've been published by anyone who does not know me personally. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's something to be said about forging friendships through the work and improving the quality of one's work through these friendships, as much as we fight, you know.
Oh, certainly. um yeah, yeah, I think that's, yeah, it's certainly something that I think about all the time. It's like a good way of like recentering myself, being like,
Yeah.
you know, oftentimes even when I feel like I'm not being particularly generative in my own work or that kind of thing, I just put that energy into supporting that person's endeavor or attending this person's thing, and inevitably, literally 10 out of 10 times after doing that for a period of time, I find myself like restored in some sense, or writing something down or needing to explore something, and it kind of
Yeah, you won't get ideas on your own just reading
exactly.
spines in bookstores, though I guess you can to some degree, but it's really these friendships and dialogue. And I'm going to have drinks with Brandon in a couple of hours. And yeah, the first thing I'm going to ask him is what he's reading now. So we're just pillaging each other's minds, but
Yeah,
generating something really substantial.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
where'd you go
Yeah,
to?
I went to a small liberal arts school called Franklin and Marshall in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Um, it Yeah, it's a small little place. It's a city of 60,000 people. It's quite close to slash sort of surrounded by Amish country. And so it's about a 30-ish, like the campus is about a 30-ish minute drive to this one Amish village called Bird in Hand. There's a huge indoor like farmers market of sorts in Lancaster City that a bunch of Amish and Mennonite families have stands at. They sell, you know, donuts and candles and furniture and like various preservatives and that kind of thing. Um, it was great. It's like a lovely little town. It's a wonderful place for like a day visit. Not necessarily too much to do if you're not a student or a senior citizen,
Well,
but
I went to Bennington College for 2 years, so we didn't really have any Amish around, but maybe the locals were, yeah, they were far scarier than the Amish, that's for sure.
yeah, yeah. Most people, it was generally all right over there. And yeah, and you know, I live in DC, and I'm not personally too aware of what the poetry scene here is like, beyond every now and then the bookstore throws an open mic. We've had a handful since I've started. Um, and that brings out some people of all ages and that kind of thing, and that's really cool. Um, and we have book clubs that we do every month that bring sort of a reading literary community to the store that are regular, like familiar faces. Um, but the vast majority of my like writing community is like people that kind of live all over, like
Mm.
whether they're college connects or people that I've met afterwards who were like, I'm moving to, you know, the Midwest, or I'm moving to LA, or moving to Paris or something. One, speaking of things of like, what are we reading and that kind of thing. One very, very short little poetry project that I really loved that I read at the very beginning of this year. It's called Lace and Pyrite by Ross Gay and Amy Nazuka Matatal. And they are both gardeners. And the project is about 20 pages or so. And they send poems to each other back and forth as like a sort of correspondence. And they are writing about their gardens, but obviously, as is true with all poems, like almost no poem is about just one thing. And so inevitably they end up talking about a variety of other things, and they just publish the correspondence in full. Someone writes a poem, someone receives it, they write something back, and they send it literally as letters. And it's really lovely. It's a cool project that I want to try with someone, even if nothing, like not even in a publishing sense. I just think it's really cool. And at the very, very end, they include a brief like interview that they have amongst themselves. And it was published a while back now. But one thing that stuck with me from it is, even though it's a book where they mostly talk about their gardens and like what's growing, what's not growing, you know, what are they thinking about in their daily lives and that kind of thing. Amy mentions that in one of the poems is the first time she had ever been able to, in writing, discuss her mother's death. And I think that's really remarkable in a poem about, you know, the bees that are a little too populous and they're kind of getting everywhere. And I think I don't know. I think that the idea, the various doors that like poetry opens, and how you can like kind of encourage that in one another.
And that
and
poem
so
was intended for Ross's reading.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the poem is sent to Ross, and then
Yeah.
Ross reads it and responds, and then responds, and then responds. They're separated out by seasons, and so I think there's like 3 or 4 per season. Yeah, and I think and so that correspondence is something that I hold on to as someone who has a lot of like writing friends who are not in the same city as me.
Yeah.
At least the same genre, but
yeah, and to bring together different genres under the aegis of poetry, I think is really important. So yeah, keep it epistolary.
yeah, absolutely. It seems like all the viewers in the chat are shy, but at the very least, yeah, I don't really have any other final questions for you.
Great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Evan. Thank you so much. Do you have any final questions for me?
No, I don't, but I do want to read your work, so email me.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Actually, I am curious about who this poet is in LA, because I don't know any LA poets.
Yeah, it's my friend Sandra, who is mostly actually mostly a nonfiction writer, does a lot of essays. But her name is Sandra Sanchez. But yeah, there are also some. Jessica Salgado is a really great LA-based poet. There's a really
what's the last name?
Salgado, Salgado. Yeah, and then there's another really wonderful poet who sadly passed away last year named Tanya Ingram, who is also an LA poet. Both kind of work in like the poetics of joy, and like Tanya was like a disabled poet, writes a lot about disability and lupus, but a lot of that is like centered around like, I don't know, like delight. It's never a bummer to read Tanya's work. And that's something that I hold on to a lot as someone who feels like my poetry veers. When I was younger, I felt like it veered very much in like the brooding and, you know, in a way, you know, as most teens who are writing poetry is like as a form of some form of like therapeutic release, or like, you know, angst and that kind of thing, or processing the various violences of the world and that kind of thing. But my poetry in recent years has kind of shifted to something a little bit more like life giving or affirming or generally joyful and pleasurable. Like that, I find myself more interested in what is possible and how to take like joy seriously and not think of it as something frivolous and secondary. And that idea is definitely inspired and, by so many authors and whatnot. But yeah.
Is Ross Gay one of those? My friend Ryan, a bookseller at City Lights, gave me one of his books for my birthday.
Yeah, Ross Gay he's definitely one of my favorite writers. All my coworkers would laugh at me for how often I talk about it. They're like, he mentioned Ross Gay again. But yeah, certainly. I think Ross Gay is a really great example. Another poet named Melissa Lozada Oliva is really great at having poems that are both good in terms of like depth and various in like meanings and whatnot, but also being like funny, which I think is really hard for a poem to do. But yeah, like anytime I find a poem funny, I'm always like surprised. I'm like, oh.
It's strange because I think it's so easy for poets to get a laugh at a reading because everybody's so uncomfortable to begin with and they may not want to be there. But to actually like to be funny in a poem requires some superhuman ability, unless you're being self-deprecating and it's
sure.
like stand-up comedy. You like make a joke about yourself, that'll get a few laughs, but the humor is tricky.
It is. It's hard. But anyway, thank you so much, Evan. I really appreciate
it. Thank you, Johnny.
Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Have a good night. Take care.